Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fullman. Today, we're talking about a topic that is deep in the crosshairs of the Trump administration, public education. We'll be covering the Department of Education, what the push for school vouchers actually means, and why public education is so integral to our country and our democracy. When I started this podcast, this was a specific episode that I had in mind that I really wanted to cover, and I think I found the perfect person to help us out. Jasmine Bolton joined the Partnership for the Future of Learning staff as Policy Director in February 2023, working to set and advance the network's priorities and strategies. In January 2021, President Biden appointed Jasmine to serve as Senior Counsel in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, where she helped to ensure equal access to education through the enforcement of civil rights in our nation's schools. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Jasmine was a senior staff attorney at the Bail Project. Before that, Jasmine was a policy analyst for Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign, which included a focus on informing the senator's proposed public education platform. Jasmine also received her JD with honors from Columbia University in 2014 and graduated cum laude from Harvard in 2011. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Jasmine Bolton. Jasmine, thank you so much for coming on. It is great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
I know, me too. This is such a pertinent issue in everything that's going on in the discourse, and I think this is a vital conversation that we need to be having.
Absolutely. As we'll talk about, public education touches everyone, whether they really fully appreciate it or not. We all benefit from having a strong public education system. So, this conversation needs to be had more often and more kitchen tables.
For sure. I want to start out a little bit kind of broad. Hypothetically, which isn't much of a hypothetical nowadays, if the Department of Education was eliminated today, what would that actually look like in practice?
Right. Well, so much really has to happen before the Department of Education could be eliminated, and that kind of informs what it would look like to be in a world without a Department of Education. In that world, federal student aid has already been moved somewhere else. I think the Project 2025 has suggested a public-private partnership that's going to dramatically impact, and this is not my expertise, so I'll say this right now, but that's going to impact how student loan forgiveness works. That's going to impact the types of repayment programs that are in existence. All of that will have to be worked out. It may look very different from what it is today. In addition, civil rights enforcement will have to be moved somewhere else, as well as implementation for federal programs like IDEA, which is federal legislation, right? So it can't just be eliminated. It has to be moved and overseen by somebody else, maybe somewhere like HHS. So those things will have been moved and will be run very differently. The big funding streams will likely look like block grants. That's IDEA and Title I. So what that means is that a large bucket of dollars essentially are just given to the states with some loose parameters on how the states can spend it. So for Title I, which really helps support low-income communities, students from low-income households directly, there would be a bucket of money that the state really has their say over on how to spend it. That might look like giving additional funding support to those communities, or the state could have their own priorities for how they might help low-income families and communities. That might look very different, right? And they might use Title I dollars to support those priorities, and that means they're not going to our schools that are in the most need. So you're looking at less funding for Title I. IDEA is another example. Both of these are very, very heavily regulated, right? There are formulas for how that funding is spent. There are buckets of money in IDEA for the different age ranges of students, right? Starting from birth, really. Students with disabilities can be supported by IDEA funds well before they attending kindergarten. Those dollars, even though we know IDEA has never been fully funded, Title I funding is not enough to meet the needs of our low-income communities, but they set a floor. They set a very important minimum standards that states have to rise above. You take away those standards and you're going to see some slippage. You're going to see, even in states with generally good education policies, you're going to see some of those protections start to slip away. So if you're a student, if you're in a family with a student who has a disability, that may look like less well-trained educators in your classroom. It may look like more students in your classroom with fewer teachers. It may look like less opportunities to integrate into the traditional learning environment. It may look like segregation, right, for students with disabilities. So all of those things are very real implications that people will feel. It may look like school closures in rural communities. It may look like far less programming in rural communities for students. You know, if you want to be a scientist, well, there may not be a science lab in your high school, right? You might have to forego some of those classes or try to take them after school or try to travel an hour or two away to attend high school that does have those classes. It may look like being kind of shunted into trade school at a faster and higher rate. And there's nothing wrong with trade school, of course. All of our trades are important. We should be encouraging people to pursue trades, but we should be encouraging people to pursue trades based on their interests, not based on, their zip code. So that's kind of what you'll likely start to see fairly quickly, because state budgets, school education budgets, school budgets are already under a lot of stress. And so the second you take these dollars away, you're going to see some big changes really, really fast.
So would it be correct to assume that, should this funding go away, it then becomes up to the states? They're not obligated then to fund students with disabilities or those low-income schools beyond what's deemed absolutely necessary.
Well, the law itself would not change, right? So getting rid of the Department of Education doesn't repeal IDEA. However, the accountability measures that ensure that states are adhering to the law, to the spirit and not just the letter of the law, those measures would go away, which means schools are now disincentivized to do the things that right now they have to do. As this is the standard. This is the standard you have to meet to be in compliance with IDEA, and we are checking. If you take away that we are checking, schools are now incentivized to spend that money elsewhere. And if they have priorities that align with the law, right, themselves, that they then decide to fund themselves, then, it's not that they are out of compliance. They're not violating the letter of the law necessarily, but certainly the spirit. And it really, it's the disparities between communities, right? So there are communities that may not see the same impact, that have a stronger connection with their state capital. Maybe this is where big business communities, where there are a lot of either political donors or perhaps folks who maybe work for companies that are important to the state, they're important constituencies, their schools may not be affected so much. But communities that hold less political power, those schools are going to see a hit, because if you're complying over here, that might be enough to say that you're in compliance with the law. The fact that it's not equal across the state is will be a much harder point to identify without those accountability measures.
Right. So we see a lot in the public discourse that there does seem to be a lot of kind of misconceptions about what exactly the Department of Education has control over. I'm wondering if you could tell me, how much power does the Department of Education actually have over local schools?
Yeah. So that, of course, is going to depend on the area, but generally very little, right? Like, so the department is not allowed, and I repeat, is not allowed to set the curriculum in any school. So that is left up to the state, it's left up to the district, and to some degree, of course, it's left up to the school. What the Department of Education does have, it's not even whole purview, because they share a lot of this with the Department of Justice already, is the enforcement of civil rights laws and the accountability of federal grant programs. And that's kind of really their big say. And even still, when you're thinking about those big programs that I just named, and there are a few others as well, that still really only accounts for between 8 and 12% of a school's budget. So it's not really that much. And of course, it's a little more when we're in a time of crisis, and then it'll kind of dip back down again, and it varies by state. But the Department of Education's funding really isn't that big of a piece of the pie of the overall funding for a school as it is. What the Department of Education can do and does do is they do a lot of research that schools and states can't fund on their own, because it's expensive, into how students learn, how we develop strong teachers who want to stay in the profession. How do we monitor how students are learning? whether this particular learning strategy is effective, where we are compared to where, 10 years ago in terms of student achievement. So there is the relatively modest amount of funding that the federal government provides. There is oversight on civil rights law. And then there is a lot of really, really helpful research that helps improve our schools if they choose to use it, right? Schools are not obligated to build on that research, to incorporate that research if they feel like something else is working for them better, right? They're not obligated to use that. That is purely to help, to assist as needed, as wanted by schools. So that's kind of how I usually describe it. It's been kind of blown out of proportion in this political discourse, this sort of like the idea of indoctrination by the federal government. But that just is not how the Department of Education, to be honest, is set up to prevent that, to limit the federal government's ability to have that sort of coercive control over school curriculum.
So going off of that, I'm wondering if you could tell me, in your opinion, what do you think some of the biggest misconceptions about what the Department of Education does are?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty big one right there, is this idea that it is setting the curriculum for the nation. I think the other piece is that the Office of Civil Rights is pushing an agenda. And just, as someone who worked in the Office of Civil Rights, I cannot stress enough how talented and important the attorneys that work there are. They are a ballast. They do not sway in the wind. And even if they will tell you, right? Even as when we were there, I was there with the Biden administration, of course, and they'll say, this isn't beyond what the law allows. This is what the law allows, period. There is not a comma, there's a period at the end of the sentence, and they're committed to being that sort of informative source, not being swayed by the politics of the administration of the time. So this idea that the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education is left-leaning, that it's, got some sort of agenda is just incorrect. And I really encourage people to remember that there are actual people who work there who choose this work because they want to support students and they believe in what the law allows, right? That is their kind of driving factor for taking this job in the first place. So that's a really big one. I mean, of course, I'm biased in my experience, there. So yeah, I'll leave it at. All
right. I'm wondering if we can now talk about who stands to benefit if the Department of Education is eliminated.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really hard question because in reality, none of us benefit. The Department of Education serves all of us. It helps ensure that all of our schools get the minimum funding that they need to serve their communities. And we all rely on public schools, even the people who are so strongly criticizing them right now. But I think that the politicization of public schools has really been manipulated, I would say, by conservative, anti-democratic forces. It's hard to say that because I don't believe that all conservatives feel this way. I don't believe that, but there are voices out there that are seeking to undermine public schools because of what schools do in their nature. Schools introduce us to new ideas. They introduce us to people that don't look like us, that don't think like us. They teach us how to get along with folks from different backgrounds. That is a big part of their purpose. And in kind of breaking down those barriers that we have in our society by putting us next to people that we wouldn't maybe otherwise be next to, they make space for thought and advancement that some folks maybe don't like that much, right? And that doesn't mean that going to school is going to turn you into a liberal. There are plenty of really, really smart people who've gone to lots of school who have conservative tax policy. That happens too, So it's just that there is a natural fear of change and difference that can be built upon to support certain political movements. So when I think about this, it's like, it really kind of spirals during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really sad because, when you go back to March 2020, as school starts to close and then we kind of reopen it in a virtual education moment, there was a little brief moment of like appreciation for educators and all of the work they do and how hard it is to like teach some things that we would consider just like basic tenets of our life, like teaching addition, you know what I mean? Teaching subtraction, how to make those connections in young minds. And people really started to like appreciate what educators do. And I remember there being a voice about, we need to pay teachers more. And it was like kind of gaining traction. But by the start of that next school year, that appreciation kind of turned to animus, right? Some parents saw school closures as a disregard for student need. I mean, of course, like as I just mentioned, being in school, being sitting next to a person who is different from you, learning in person is better. It is better for most students. And so virtual learning really had an impact, and it had an impact on the students themselves. It had an impact on parents who were trying to ensure that their students were learning while also working full time. And that was really hard. It cannot be understated how difficult that was. You add on to that sort of anxiety, the backlash to the protests against the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and there was this real antipathy to what was, anti-racism, just to be quite frank. And I want to take a step back for a moment to situate us in history. In the last 10 to 20 years, schools have made a lot of really incredible progress on how they can serve their students in their communities, in their schools, in their classrooms. That has meant really diving into culturally responsive learning, really thinking about how we rely on testing and how we might change that reliance on testing to actually reflect what and how students are learning. My first kind of foray into education work was working on challenging a state law in Arizona that banned ethnic studies, and that was used to attack a Mexican-American studies in the Tucson Unified School District. That ultimately was successful. The program was reinstated. But what was important about the program was that they actually went and looked back at like how students learn. They looked back at studies, and they developed curriculums that were suited to the city of Tucson, the public school students that were attending school there, who were majority Mexican and Mexican American and indigenous, right? And so by bringing in some of those concepts from those student cultures, they were able not only to improve kind of outcomes for students, they were able to improve outcomes for students who had been struggling the most in the years prior. So the students who had either been retained for a grade or were under the threat of being retained, right, were the ones that were excelling the most in these programs. So that is people are starting to realize, and it's playing it out across cultures, across communities. And it's really, really great, really, really important work that, in addition to social and emotional learning, right? Like from the very, very, very foundations of our education, right? Teaching kids how to express their emotions, how to receive emotions, how to engage with students around them while they're also everybody's feeling all of, that was really developed in relation to teaching students with disabilities. And once you see how impactful it was, how successful that sort of strategy was, applying it across the school has a huge impact in how kids learn to communicate with one another and how they build relationships, right? Which is the foundation for who they're going to be and how they're going to relate as adults. All of these really, really great developments became kind of seen as a threat, and they were kind of, in a way, bastardized by the discourse, so that they took on this kind of negative view, and a lot of people felt threatened by them. They're not political developments, right? They're all based in what an individual school, an individual student needs to succeed and to thrive.
Yeah, I remember I think it was 2021, like when school started going back, and social emotional learning was a huge buzzword. Especially, I have a Twitter account and I only follow conservatives on it because I like to know what they're up to. And I remember a big part of the discourse was, social emotional learning is going to turn your sons gay. What?
Like, just the most, ridiculous. It's meant to scare people. And I think that ties into something else, right? Like what is at the root of so much that's happening in our political movement is the changing demographics of our country, right? And the way that is hitting schools first. We know that students of color are disproportionately present in public schools as opposed to the general population. So as the population does get more diverse, right? Schools are really at the forefront of that. And so creating schools to serve their community looks like creating schools that do disservice to white students. But that's not true, right? Like the reality is you can have culturally relevant curriculum in Appalachia. That is maybe a majority white school, but still drawing on curricula or experiences in their community to help inform how the students learn, to help make connections. So this is not about it's not a racial thing. It's not even a political thing. It's just that it's been used to stoke fear because of all of these other things that are happening. And it's very frustrating because no, it is not. Social emotional learning is not going to turn anyone gay. That's not how that works, but it will make your student better able to communicate their needs, which is good for you and it's good for all of us.
Right. And I think almost every guest I have on, the common thread is like these things are based on fear. And I think that is really just the calling card for a lot of the policy that we see now. And the fact that it's an education is certainly not surprising, but I'm hoping we can change topics a little bit and go into vouchers and private schools. Vouchers have become a very big talking point, and I'm wondering if you can first explain what are school vouchers and why do they exist?
Sure. Yes, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I will get to that in a minute. But first, what is a school voucher? There's lots of terms. There's education and savings accounts, tax credits, scholarships, lots of different terms being thrown out there. Basically, a school voucher program uses public funds to pay for private education costs. So that's it. If you see a program that's using public funds to pay for a private education cost, it's a voucher. It's that simple. You don't have to go into the ins and outs and hows and whys. Just are these public funds? Are they going to private education costs? That doesn't necessarily mean just a private school. It could be a private tutoring program. It could be any number of programs that are not necessarily sending a kid to a private school. Is this taking a public good and providing it to a private service provider?
So are the policies that we've seen, I think specifically, if I recall, coming out of Florida, where it's the school choice law or whatever it is, are those voucher programs?
Yes.
Okay.
Those are voucher programs to the tune of $4 billion, voucher programs. And you asked where they came from. And that's a really, really, really important question because I think people don't really fully appreciate the history and how that history is still with us today. Vouchers are deeply, deeply rooted in segregation. They first appeared as a response to the desegregation requirements put in place by federal courts. As the courts required public schools to integrate, some states allowed and even encouraged white families to withdraw their children from public schools to attend segregated private schools with state dollars. If a white parent didn't want their child in a classroom with a Black student, they could use public funds to send their child to a school that doesn't admit Black students. And that sounds like ancient history. We kind of like to treat this as if it were years and years ago. To be clear, the students who integrated schools are still with us today. My mother attended and graduated from segregated high schools. But more importantly, that idea that public schools must be accessible to all children and they must be able to attend free from discrimination is at the root of the public school experience today. States that are providing vouchers have exempted schools receiving those vouchers from these anti-discrimination laws. And that means the schools can and do discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity, based on religion, based on disability status. If a parent today doesn't want their child to be in a classroom with someone who identifies as LGBTQ+ or is of a different religion, they can use public funds through these vouchers to send their child to a school that won't admit those other quote unquote students. Does that sound familiar? It's the same ploy.
Right. So as you covered, originally they were intended for anti-desegregation purposes. So is it correct to assume that nowadays the intention is really in the same kind of vein to keep certain demographics of students away from other demographics of students?
I think it is a little bit broader. I think it is to dismantle a system that believes that all students have a right to a quality education. And this is where I have to say, sorry, I have to bring in some of my personal experience.
No, go ahead. We love those.
I, as a Black woman, I attended a private school, and it was a choice that my parents made for me. And so, and the school that I attended was a really great school. I had really great opportunities coming out of it. And so, earlier in my career, I looked at that school as a model. This is what you can do when you provide quality education. I think as I've gotten older, I have had to situate my experience with the reality of what that school is and it does. I attended an all-girl Christian school already, not accessible for a whole lot of people. It's great for educating people who learn traditionally. It did not serve well students who do not learn traditionally. I don't recall being in school with students who had notable disabilities, like visible, right? That it was not accessible in that way. And, the policy towards students who were LGBTQ plus was horrendous. So I think as I think about what it means to quote unquote be able to choose your school and all of that, and I think about how public funds play into that, I go back to that piece about we use our public schools to serve all children, and they teach people how to be and interact and account for all these different types of people that exist in our world. The school that I went to did not have that, right? I was one of 2 Black girls the whole time. There were only but a handful of minorities at all in the school, in my class at least. And then it was like we were surrounded by excessive privilege, right? It's just not meant to serve all of our students, and shouldn't be, right? I'm sorry, private schools, they're not meant to serve everyone, and that's good for them. But for our public schools, our public dollars, we have to be really sure that we're using them to serve all of our students. And so that's kind of how I've evolved with it. I understand this comes from a position of privilege. My parents made a choice for me that others cannot make. I sit with that all the time about how my school just wasn't equipped to serve literally the majority of people in our country.
Right. And I mean, I'm a white woman. So I again come at this from a place of privilege, but I also went to public grade schools, K through 8. But then for high school, I went to a private Jesuit high school. And they loved to tout around the students of color, which there was a decent chunk. It was not at all like your experience where there was only 2. They loved to have the pictures of their students of color on their website, but then would not respond to real and concrete instances of racism and problematic behavior. They love to say, we have 96 Chicago area zip codes represented. What are you doing to serve those zip codes? And again, it was a place where disabilities were not represented. Everybody appeared very affluent. We all wore uniforms. We all looked the same. But when you really got into it, especially our senior year, we had this optional class called Justice Seminar. It was the religion class for senior year. And it was an eye-opener because it was really the first time that the students who had been so underserved by the school got to say, hey, I'm being underserved by this institution. And I look back and I'm grateful for the time that I had there. I think it really shaped my morals, who I am, who I stand for. But they really had a reckoning around 2020 where a lot of the students of color stood up and said, you are not serving us. You didn't serve us when we were there, and you're continuing not to serve your students of color. And it really made me look back and go, okay, well, was this private education really so great if a decent chunk of the student body was not being served?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's really that's what I'm talking about, right? I have my own experiences with this school. I was deeply traumatized, right? Like they were not equipped. It's not just not equipped to serve me as a Black girl who started there when she was 5. They also weren't equipped to, and aren't, if I have to be honest, equipped to prepare the white girls who attend this school for the world that actually exists, right? Like they're not teaching students how to interact across race, across sexual orientation, across religion. And so things were said that were awful, and they just kind of were. And then you just kind of have to exist with this person who has already told you that they don't believe that you are a person to the same extent that they are a person. And that's really hard, as a child to grow up with. It is just, and so for me, I'm like, these schools are not meant to serve Black students. And I can't imagine a world in which I put my child in that experience, because it was deeply painful and like has really led to a lot of therapy. You know what I mean? Where it's like, I have to really examine, like, I coped by forcing myself to excel. That's how I learned to cope in this environment. And so I put a lot of value on excelling. That is not good for your health. Like it pushes, I push myself way too hard, even as an adult today. Like I don't know how to detach myself from the things that I do, because the only thing that taught me that I would get good feedback and that I deserved to be in a place was by being better, right? And that's so unhealthy. And I know this is not, we have devolved so far, but it's really important to, like, again, what public schools are meant to do is to make sure that people feel like this is a place where they just belong. They don't have to prove, they don't have to be something. They, as they are, belong and are entitled to access this space. This space is meant to serve them and their families and their communities. And that is at the basics of what public schools do and bring. It allows children to develop. They allow children to develop in a way that doesn't have to end in like a value asserting thing, And I think for some people who attend private schools, that's also true. That wasn't true for me as a Black kid. And as for other, like, my friends, right, who attended similar schools, attended my school earlier or later on, it's the same story.
So historically, I know you mentioned vouchers came about as schools were being desegregated. Do you have any insight as to the numbers? So were they super popular, in the 60s as schools were integrating, and now are they having kind of a resurgence?
So yeah, like desegregation academies, or segregation academies, I should say, really, really popped up in the 70s in particular, as deseg really, really ramped up. There's a lot of really good research about this generation that started school in the 70s and graduated in the 80s, this cohort that was one of our most integrated cohorts ever. And if you look back at their achievement levels, they're still kind of highs or close to highs, because of, it was before things started to be kind of systematically dismantled. But so they did start to taper off, as they're, like, in general, there was a little more of a crackdown, and states kind of stepped away from them. And then they picked up steam again, starting really in the 2000s.
What do we know about the impact of school vouchers on student performance and educational equity?
Yeah, that's so important, because there were a few myths that I wanted to really tackle in terms of like how vouchers affect schools and individual students. So you asked about student performance, and that's one of the big myths around vouchers. There's this idea that the private school is better than the public option. And that's particularly true in communities where public schools are struggling. However, we have to really dive into the quality of the private schools that are available through vouchers. Most vouchers don't come close to covering the cost of the truly high quality private schools in the area. So a voucher might be capped at like $7,000, $8,000, maybe $10,000, whereas the private schools that are really, known for offering quality education are over $20,000. So for folks coming from low-income communities, folks coming from public schools that are really struggling, they usually can't afford that type of private school. So they're forced to choose from private schools that are just academically less rigorous, right? And often less rigorous than the public school that they're leaving. It can be hard to tell because these voucher programs don't always require, and sometimes intentionally don't require, testing and accountability that would show whether or not the private school is actually providing a higher quality education than the public school that the student is leaving. But we have seen, we know from study after study, in state after state after state, is that voucher schools have failed to outperform public schools. And in many cases, many cases, the students that are attending voucher schools saw significantly less achievement than their peers attending public schools, often the public school that they left behind. And so that's just the quality itself of the academic performance, right? The academic rigor of the school. That doesn't factor in the students' long-term sort of retention. A lot of what you'll see is a student attending a private school through a voucher, getting in, but not being able to stay for any number of reasons that aren't really the fault of the student, but sometimes even through the end of the initial school year. And so then they're put back into a public school, and that public school is often not kind of recompensated the funding that it would have gotten for the school student enrolled initially. The other thing that kind of plays into that is another myth that kind of comes up, which is that vouchers offer parents a choice when their traditional public school has failed them. But in reality, it's the private school, not the parent, that has the choice. So the private school can choose who it wants to admit, even if a student gets the voucher, right? They get the voucher, they still have to get into the private school. And if the private school decides that student is not fit for them, whether that's because they come from a different religion than the majority of the students in the private school, maybe those students are queer, that student might have a disability, or they just may feel that student is not academically what they're looking for, that student won't get into that private school. It's not actually giving the students who need them that extra choice that is so often promised. And they don't even really have to explain why the student doesn't get in. And that kind of pokes a hole in the next myth, which is that these programs are meant to serve low-income communities. Take away, right, the admission process. Let's say the student gets in. Well, vouchers don't cover the cost of transportation. They don't cover the cost of books. They don't cover the cost of uniforms. They don't cover the cost of meals. So a parent who receives them must account for those additional costs and logistics. If your kid's school is now across town, the school gets out at 3, you have to arrange transportation or pay for really expensive after-school care in order for your kid to be able to attend the school. That's on top of the cost of tuition. And if you're looking at a voucher that doesn't even really cover the cost of tuition itself, or just barely covers the cost of tuition, then all of those additional costs fall onto the parent. And most parents that are coming from these communities just simply can't afford it. It's not meant for them. So I know that's the long answer to your question about academic quality, but I think it's all wrapped up together, which is the schools that are most likely to admit voucher students from low-income communities do not meet the expectations of academic rigor that parents have when they initiate the voucher program in the first place.
Kind of going off the myth thing, critics argue that vouchers take money away from public schools. Is that accurate, or is that a myth?
So it's accurate. There's 2 levels to it. There are some programs like Ohio where there is a dollar for dollar offset, in that the money allocated for sending kids to the private school comes directly out of the education funding. In other states, it's a little bit harder to make the connection because the money that's allocated to voucher programs comes from more of a general pot. And so it's not like it's directly pulling from educational funding, but it comes broadly from public funding that could be allocated to education, for example, or any number of other things. But I think what's at the root of the issue where it undeniably pulls from public education funding is that like most of our funding is based on a per pupil allocation. So if you have a voucher program that pulls 30 kids out of an elementary school, let's say the elementary school has maybe like 400 students, so 30 kids out of an elementary school, well, you're not going to get funding for the 30 students that you would have had in that school. So that's 30 students less funding. But if those 30 are spread over the whole elementary school, you're not able to reduce class sizes. You're not able to cut a class. You still have to provide all the same overhead costs, the same number of teachers, the same number of classrooms, the same services that you would have had to provide if you had those 30 students, right? So in reality, you are just down funding that you would have had, but not down costs. So yes, it does, right? They're trying to devise ways to prevent that sort of harm, but inevitably, eventually, right, you lose the students, you lose the funding that would have come with those students.
Moving kind of back to the push against public education, we've seen this happening between book bans, curriculum restriction, and changes. In your opinion, what do you think is driving this? We talked a little bit about the fear aspect, but I'm wondering if there's any other thing that you think is really pushing this, what I would call a restriction on information.
I mean, there are a lot of, it's almost like a sort of vortex of issues that are all kind of coming together at the same time. So you have a lot of very sort of wealthy people who are spending a lot of money to kind of create misconceptions in the public about what public schools can do, what the Department of Education can do. And in reality, those are the people who stand to benefit, right, from voucher programs. Those are the people whose children are already attending public school, who look at this as a tax write-off, maybe a tax write-off and an opportunity to like get some money taken off their own bills at private schools. That people who don't believe in the concept of public education as a public good or public goods at all, kind of putting their finger on the scale to create misconceptions, as I said. And then there is just, in general, what's happening in our discourse more broadly, where you have social media corners, people who kind of engage in social media in a way that doesn't provide a full picture. And that's obviously, we know it is happening on both sides of the political spectrum. There is a little bit more capture, I think, of social media from the conservative perspective right now. I know that it's like, that's a contentious thing to say. When you look at the most popular podcasts and YouTubers, they tend to be more conservative or quote unquote libertarian. I quibble with that. And so that is all kind of playing into kind of the timing of coming out of this pandemic, where not only are our students less equipped to communicate their needs and feelings and to build relationships, but also adults are struggling with that as well. So a lot of things have come together to kind of really ramp up the attack on public education at this time. I think the one thing we haven't really leaned into as much is the role that public education plays in democracy. So there is also like a sort of anti-democratic kind of wind behind these things.
Well, hang on, because that's my next question.
Oh, great.
So we should move to that. So some argue that the movement and the pushback against public schools isn't just about education, but it's also about reshaping democracy itself. Do you see it that way?
I mean, absolutely. If you think about it, schools are examples of democracy in practice. They are the piece of our democracy that we are the most connected to. We engage in electing a board, but beyond that, like we communicate with our teachers, our administrators, and that relationship is meant to be a sort of give and take, right? Where teachers and administrators have their expertise that they bring to bear, community members and parents have their experience that they bring to bear, and we come together to create a system that supports the students and the community that they live in. And so even when you think about in the classroom, students are learning to exercise their voice and to engage in democracy as it unfolds in front of them in that moment. And ideally, sitting next to somebody who might think differently, who might look differently, who has a different lived experience. So it is this like microcosm of what our democracy is supposed to be. It teaches us how to engage as we become adults, even though we don't really realize it's happening when we're participating in it ourselves as students. So it is critical that we have functioning public schools if you're going to have a functioning democracy. And that's just in how it works, how schools work. That doesn't get into like what schools teach, teaching about civics, of course, but also like teaching deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, all of these tools that we then use to analyze who is going to best represent us, what we think, what our own individual beliefs are in terms of what a democratic government should do and be for its citizens. And so that is and has always been a threat. It has always been a threat to people who want to hoard power. In any system in the world, controlling the schools is, in order to limit knowledge, is a tool for folks who want to hoard and hold on to power in an anti-democratic way. So, yes, to answer your question, yeah, like people who don't want to be responsible to or responsive to the voice of the people, are going to attack our public schools. And it's our job to ensure that our schools continue to be exemplars of democracy so that we can have democracy continue, So yeah, it's critical, I think, to a functioning democracy.
We are clearly in a very contentious time with public education. What can people do, regular citizens do, if they want to push back against these attacks on public education?
Yeah, it's important to remember what I kind of said at the beginning, which is that schools are local enterprises. And no matter what the federal government is doing, we have to engage with our schools as ours, the schools in your communities, ensuring that they are being present, right? So knowing who the teachers are, showing up for school programming. And this doesn't necessarily just speak to parents. It means investing in our schools as community building blocks. So serving as a mentor, providing mentorship programs, showing up at your school board meeting, knowing what's kind of happening and how schools are serving your community specifically, what's working, what's not working, and standing up for it. Schools are under a lot of stress right now. There are a lot of, for other reasons that we haven't talked about, a lot of like funding issues that are coming to bear at this moment. And they're going to make tough decisions. And so understanding what those decisions are, being vocal about what you're not willing to lose, and going to your state house, supporting others to go to your state house, signing a petition. It means getting invested and staying invested. We can't back down because we're afraid of the size of the force against us. We still have to really double down on our investment in this system that really serves all of us, whether or not we attended public school ourselves, whether we have children in public schools. It's still critical to our individual communities that these schools succeed.
So I feel like public education is almost a lot like foreign aid, and that it's a little bit hard to justify it to the public, especially if they're not using public schools or they see them as these bad entities. So if somebody were to walk up to you on the street and said, you have 2 minutes to tell me, why does public education matter? What would your response be?
Yeah, it goes back to the number one people who public schools serve, and that's students. Education makes us better people. It is not necessarily about, I went on to have a super successful career. It's like, it teaches us about life. It encourages us to ask questions, to reach out to the person next door, to learn about something that we maybe had never heard of before. It teaches us to be kind. It teaches us to be the type of neighbor that you want. All of these really, really important life lessons really come out of school. And if we as a community, as a society, don't invest in our schools, in our children, what are we saying about the type of communities we want to create and live in? We want to live in a space where people are kind, where people are curious, where people look why I said something. Maybe they're a little skeptical. Maybe they're going to ask the question, where people will follow up, where people will understand kind of the interlocking nature of our society, right? And if we want that, we have to invest in it. And we can't just leave it up to chance. If we leave it up to chance, that's kind of what we get. Like, you get what you pay for in that sense. So that's what I always go back to, is who do I want to live next door to? And how do I help ensure that I'm creating a society that builds the type of neighbor that I want, that builds me into the type of neighbor I want to be? And I think public schools are critical to that.
That was a great answer. I really, really love that. That is all I have. Thank you so much for coming on. Your expertise is invaluable. And like you said at the top, this is a conversation that we need to be having at kitchen tables. I hope that people take this conversation and go forward knowing the value that public education has for them.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation, and you're doing such great work. So it's been a joy.
Yep, thank you. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. And thank you to Jasmine for giving us a much needed overview on public education in the US. I feel like I learned a lot about the realities of what we often see or hear in the news, especially as somebody who attended public schools from K through 8th grade. It's been crazy for me to watch the general public turn on our public schools, and I really feel like we somehow lost our way in this renewed fight against public education. Hopefully this episode gave you something to think about, as well as maybe invigorated you to support policies and politicians that support public education. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with somebody who could use this information. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or you just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and support our public schools. As for the rest of the month, I will see you guys next week in the briefing room, and because March is a little bit weird with 5 Mondays, I will definitely be taking the 31st off, but next week we will chat about the current news. So I will see you guys soon.